On the 12th of July, 1943, a train's iron wheels ground against the heated rails, shrieking a protest as sparks erupted in the noonday sun. Dust billowed from the Texas prairie, clinging to the perspiration of the soldiers confined within the boxcar. They had been led to believe their destination meant ignominy, retribution, perhaps even starvation. Whispers circulated that America would treat them as mere livestock, beings devoid of any worth. However, as the brakes hissed and the carriages shuddered to a halt, the first sight to greet their eyes was not the stark geometry of concrete edifices or the menacing silhouette of machine-gun turrets, but a man. He rested against a fence post, one boot casually hooked on the rail, a wide-brimmed hat shielding his eyes, the glint of metal spurs catching the relentless sun. The German POWs pressed against the barred windows, squinting through the grime and their own disbelief. One uttered a word that oscillated between reverence and derision. Cowboy. He had encountered them before, but only on the silver screen, in American motion pictures smuggled into Germany prior to the conflict. For the majority of these men, Hollywood represented a realm of illusion, a world as remote as fairy tales. Yet here he stood, a figure of flesh and dust, framed by an expansive sky that seemed to taunt their confinement. As the train doors clanged open, the air rushed in, heavy with the scent of sagebrush, cattle, and manure. It was not the fetid odor of warfare, but the pervasive aroma of life itself, resilient and unbroken. The prisoners disembarked, blinking against the light, their shackles not of metal, but of profound exhaustion. Their boots sank into the loose earth, a stark contrast to the cobblestone streets of Bremen, Hamburg, or Berlin. They had anticipated jeers, the jab of rifle muzzles against their ribs, and snarled commands. Instead, the guards, largely farmers conscripted into service, observed them with quiet patience. And among them stood more men, adorned with broad-brimmed hats and leather footwear, Americans who appeared less like soldiers of an industrial colossus and more like characters plucked from pulp fiction. A comrade later chronicled in his diary, "I felt as though we had been transported onto a cinematic set. Horses grazed beyond the enclosure, and the men who watched over us carried themselves not as tormentors, but as ranch hands tending their flock. It was we who were the flock now." The irony was palpable. These were men who had served in Rommel's Africa Corps, who had endured the deserts of Tunisia, who had subscribed to the notion of German supremacy. Yet here, stripped of their arms and their pride, they were confronted by Americans whose weaponry was not merely carbines, but a lifestyle. Relaxed, self-assured, a product of vast, open landscapes. To the Germans, accustomed to rigid stratifications and bellowed directives, the cowboys' relaxed posture and easy silence conveyed a distinct form of authority. A sergeant barked an order to form ranks, but even as they complied, many found themselves unable to avert their gaze from the horizon. There were no imposing walls, no endless coils of barbed wire stretching into infinity, only the prairie, the ripple of grass under the wind, and the faint, distant movement of cattle. A peculiar disquietude settled upon them. This was indeed captivity, but it also offered a form of liberation utterly foreign to those who had lived under the iron fist of the Reich. As they were escorted toward the camp, the barbed wire fence came into view. It appeared almost fragile, understated compared to their grim expectations. The wooden guard towers stood, yet were unmanned for the moment, their ladders empty. Guards ambled rather than marched. Some even offered a tip of their hats to the local populace who had gathered to witness their arrival. Children perched on fence rails, their curiosity piqued by the sight of the so-called enemy. Women in sunbonnets braved the heat, whispering as they observed young German men, no older than their own sons, serving overseas. It was a scene of striking contradictions. Adversaries met with the gaze of neighbors, conquerors transformed into a spectacle. Within the camp, the layout resembled a ranch more than a prison. Long, orderly rows of wooden barracks stretched out, a mess hall at the center, and wide fields beyond where the prisoners would soon labor. The initial shock arrived with the aroma of sustenance wafting toward them, beef stew simmering, the rich scent of coffee brewing. For many, this itself was a form of cruelty. They had been assured that America would condemn them to starvation. Instead, the air was thick with the fragrance of abundance. One soldier muttered bitterly, "My mother has not tasted beef in 3 years." The cowboy, who had first captured their attention, still leaned near the fence, appearing amused by their astonishment. He chewed on a stalk of grass, spat onto the dirt, and offered a slight nod as the column passed. That simple gesture resonated more profoundly than any shouted insult. It was not a display of triumph, but of indifference, the mark of a man secure in his existence, unthreatened by their former might. The Germans were ushered into their barracks. Yet, even within, conversations buzzed about their experiences. Some maintained it was a ruse, a propaganda ploy designed to soften them before genuine hardship commenced. Others spoke in hushed tones of opportunity, of work and food, perhaps even of dignity. A young officer, barely 22 years of age, sat on his cot and murmured, "If this is captivity, it is unlike any captivity I had ever envisioned." Outside, the sounds of ranch life drifted into the camp, the bark of a dog, the neigh of a horse, the distant lowing of cattle. The prisoners lay on their bunks, listening, caught between relief and shame. They had marched into battle to expand an empire. Yet here they were, nourished and guarded by men who seemed more mythical than military. The cowboy was no fabrication. He was flesh, dust, and leather, and he lived with more freedom on the edge of a fence than they had ever experienced in the armies of Europe. Night descended with the swiftness of the desert. The horizon glowed with the lingering embers of sunlight, and the prisoners watched through the fissures in their barracks' walls. The same cowboy stood by a lantern now, its illumination tracing the outline of his hat. A harmonica's melody drifted from somewhere beyond, playing a tune that, though unfamiliar to the Germans, resonated deep within their beings. For the first time since their capture, the silence was not filled with despair, but with a perplexing sense of confusion. The day had begun with absolute certainty. Captivity meant degradation. Yet, as it concluded, uncertainty prevailed. Was this land of cattle, coffee, and cowboys truly their prison? Or, in a cruel twist of fate, did it offer a glimpse of a freedom they had never known in their homeland? And as one prisoner scribbled in his diary that night by the faint glow of a contraband candle, he penned words that would echo long after the war's end. "I fear less the barbed wire than the expanse beyond it. For the first time, I question if we are not the ones who have been enclosed all along." The dawn of the first morning arrived with a piercing whistle, slicing through the gentle hum of the prairie and jolting the Germans awake. They rose stiffly from their bunks, anticipating meager rations of watery soup or hard tack, the kind of punishment fare they had heard whispered about during their voyage. Yet, as they shuffled into the mess hall, the scene startled them. Long wooden tables were laden with steaming bowls of beef stew, slices of cornbread stacked on tin platters, and the aroma of hot, black coffee filled the room with its potent fragrance. It was not luxury by American standards, but for men who had marched through North Africa on empty stomachs or subsisted on meager provisions in Europe, it was extravagance. Some hesitated, unsure if it was a trap. A guard, his hat tilted back, beckoned them forward with a simple gesture. "Eat," he said, as if no further explanation were necessary. One prisoner lifted his spoon, sipped the broth, and closed his eyes. The beef melted on his tongue. Another bit into the cornbread and let out a quiet laugh. It was sweet, softer than any bread he had ever known. He whispered, almost with a sense of shame, "My family has not seen white flour in years." The others nodded, chewing in silence. Each mouthful served as a stark reminder that their loved ones back in Germany were enduring hunger while they, the captives, were feasting as if on holiday. Word of this abundance spread rapidly. Letters sent home, though carefully censored, still hinted at the plentiful fare. A camp report from 1944 documented one prisoner writing, "Mother, do not fret for my well-being. I consume more meat here than I did in my boyhood." Another noted the ceaseless coffee, a beverage in Germany reserved for the affluent, now poured into chipped mugs without the need for ration coupons. Some guards chuckled at the prisoners' astonishment, remarking that the menu was not even particularly special. It was what any American farmer might consume on an ordinary day. The barbed wire loomed ominously outside, but within the camp's confines, the rhythms of ranch life began to permeate. Following breakfast, prisoners were not led to punishment drills, but to work details, harvesting cotton, mending fences, tending fields, or unloading hay bales on local ranches. According to the Geneva Convention, they were permitted to undertake non-military labor, and in the agricultural regions, their presence was desperately needed. With American men serving overseas, the farms faced a severe labor shortage. Now, the enemy was tasked with carrying buckets of water, hauling sacks of grain, and guiding plows behind horses. Initially, there was grumbling. Many POWs considered farm labor beneath their status as soldiers. Some attempted to resist, hoping for a conflict that would validate the alleged cruelty of their captors. However, the guards seldom raised their voices. They indicated, demonstrated, and sometimes even joined in. One cowboy, sweat streaming from beneath his hat, showed a young German how to lift a hay bale without injuring himself. The prisoner, feeling a flush of embarrassment, emulated his example. Later, in the barracks, he admitted he had never before witnessed a figure of authority assist rather than command. Compensation was another surprise. Each man received credits, approximately 80 cents per day, for his labor. This could be exchanged at the camp canteen for toiletries, stationery, or even minor luxuries such as chocolate or cigarettes. For men who had been indoctrinated with the belief that they would be starved, this simple transaction felt surreal. A German corporal once remarked with bitter humor, "I fought for Hitler and gained nothing. I picked cotton for a cowboy, and I am paid." The cultural exchanges multiplied. On Sundays, local farmers who had hired POWs occasionally offered them lemonade, biscuits, or even a chair on their porch. One elderly Texan recounted decades later how a young German had helped him repair a fence, then sat quietly on the steps, gazing out at the vast expanse of land. When asked his thoughts, the prisoner replied, "I have never seen a country so large that it does not seem to end." His voice conveyed awe, not resentment. However, this abundance introduced a new form of conflict. Within the barracks, some men grew disquieted. They feared they were becoming complacent, seduced by the food and fairness, thereby betraying their loyalty to the Reich. Others whispered that the Americans had no right to treat them so well, suggesting it was a humiliation more profound than physical beatings. A few clung stubbornly to Nazi ideology, sneering at fellow prisoners who laughed during work or savored American meals. Tension simmered, dividing the men between those who held fast to their old pride and those who began to question the true meaning of strength. In official reports, American officers documented these internal divisions. Some camps even segregated the hardliners, fearing they would intimidate the others. Yet, in the everyday interactions, these boundaries blurred. A man might enter captivity declaring his inherent superiority, only to find himself humming cowboy tunes overheard from guards a week later, tapping his foot as he washed down cornbread with another mug of coffee. The sensory details became indelibly etched into memory. The creak of saddle leather as guards patrolled the fences, the hiss of cornbread batter on a hot skillet, the scent of freshly cut hay drifting through open barracks windows. These sensations belonged not to prisoners, but to free men. Yet, here the Germans lived among them, experiencing America not as conquerors or tourists, but as reluctant guests who, nonetheless, found themselves irrevocably altered. One prisoner later confessed in his memoir, "We anticipated beatings, but none were inflicted. Instead, they provided us with bread so white it shamed us. They poured coffee until we were weary of it. They compensated us for working their land. In their generosity, I found not solace but confusion." His words captured the essence of the internal struggle. How could an adversary display kindness when their own leaders demanded cruelty? Yet, even within this paradox, humor found its way in. A Texas guard recalled teaching a German lieutenant how to rope a calf during their leisure time. The officer attempted the feat, missed, tried again, and ended up ensnared in his own lasso, much to the amusement of the Americans. The guard later quipped, "That was the only German officer I saw surrender twice in one day." For the prisoners, laughter became both a source of shame and a release, a recognition that the world they had been taught to scorn was not only more robust but also possessed a freer spirit. By autumn, the camp's routines had become almost habitual. Work, meals, correspondence, leisure, and the occasional baseball game observed through the fences. However, beneath this surface of normalcy, the shock of abundance continued to resonate. They consumed beef while their families subsisted on potatoes. They drank endless coffee while mothers and wives stood in ration lines. Each spoonful was both a gift and a wound. One evening, after a laborious day of hauling hay, a group of Germans lingered by the fence as the sun dipped below the plains. Beyond the wire, a cowboy lit a lantern, its glow illuminating his weathered face. He tipped his hat and departed, leaving behind only the chirping of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. One prisoner whispered, "He labors more diligently than we do, yet he is free. Why do they treat us with greater kindness than our own leaders?" The question hung heavy in the warm night air. The men returned to their barracks, silent, unsettled. They were physically sated with bread and beef, yet their minds were empty of answers. And as the lights extinguished, more than one individual mused whether the true confinement lay within the fence or within the deeply ingrained beliefs they had carried from their homeland. The days lengthened, not with monotony, but with peculiar discoveries. Within the confines of the barbed wire, life began to assume rhythms that felt almost civilized, unsettlingly so. The Germans had anticipated their dissolution into punishment, yet they found opportunities previously unknown in their own homeland. The barracks, which soon carried the scent of hay and soap, soon echoed with the scratch of pencils, the rustle of pages, and the murmur of lessons. America, it transpired, was willing to educate its captives. Classes materialized in the dusty camp halls. English instruction was provided by school teachers, woodworking skills were imparted by farmers who also served as guards, and even lectures in mathematics and history were delivered by the prisoners themselves. Some men hunched over desks, slowly deciphering halting English phrases. Others painstakingly hammered together rudimentary chairs or carved small figures from pine wood, the fragrance of wood shavings clinging to their attire. By night, the barracks glowed faintly with lantern light as men meticulously copied vocabulary words into their notebooks, whispering, "Hello, coffee cowboy," experimenting with the pronunciation of each syllable. This was an unexpected form of freedom. Inside the fence, their world expanded. One prisoner later wrote, "I acquired more knowledge in 1 year of captivity than in all the years of Hitler's pronouncements." The irony was sharp. Behind barbed wire, under the scrutiny of supposed adversaries, they discovered a space for contemplation. Music also permeated the nights. Germans who had carried harmonicas in their kit bags began by playing mournful folk tunes of their homeland, then ventured to play the bold American cowboy songs they had overheard. Soon, makeshift camp ensembles formed. Violins strummed, accordions wheezed, and the rhythms of ranch life became interwoven with the melodies of the vanquished. Guards would occasionally pause to listen, tipping their hats in silent acknowledgement before proceeding. For the prisoners, It was disquieting to realize how readily they could emulate the sounds of a culture they had been instructed to abhor. The contradictions deepened with each passing week. Newspapers began to appear, printed on mimeograph machines, filled with essays, jokes, and even editorials. Some editions featured debates on political matters. Others offered poetry penned in cramped German script. By 1945, over 400 camp newspapers circulated throughout the United States, each one representing the voice of men who, even as captives, refused to remain silent. In one camp, an editorial posed the question openly: why do we speak of superiority when the cowboy sustains us and we cannot sustain ourselves? Such statements might have been considered treasonous in their homeland. Here, they were scribbled in ink and affixed to bulletin boards. Beyond the wire, labor continued. Prisoners harvested wheat under the vast Nebraska sky, plucked cotton in the Oklahoma heat, and branded cattle under the watchful eyes of ranchers who offered them water when the sun became too harsh. The smell of scorching leather, the hiss of branding irons, the dust coating their mouths, all became integral parts of their daily existence. Some took pride in their work, displaying calloused hands as evidence that they were not merely prisoners, but men still capable of productivity. One guard recalled an incident that remained vividly in his memory. A young, slender German soldier wiped sweat from his brow after stacking bales of hay. The rancher whose land he was working extended his hand and said simply, "Good job." The prisoner froze. In Germany, no farmer would thank a soldier. Authority demanded obedience, not gratitude. Yet here was a cowboy, dusty and sunburned, treating him as an equal in labor. The young man shook the hand, initially with awkwardness, then with a firm grip. Later that night, he confessed to a bunkmate that the handshake had affected him more profoundly than any defeat on the battlefield. However, not all embraced this new rhythm. Some hardened themselves, sneering at the perceived weakness of comrades who smiled at guards or studied English vocabulary. They branded them as traitors, men who had been ensnared by the enemy's comfort. Tensions simmered. In certain camps, staunch loyalists attempted to assert control over the barracks, bullying others into silence and reminding them of their oath to Hitler. American officials took note. Reports documented the necessity of separating the hardcore Nazis from those who simply wished to endure. The barbed wire enclosed not only prisoners, but also their internal conflicts, with old allegiances battling against new impressions. Nevertheless, the presence of the cowboy loomed large, an unspoken testament to an alternative way of life. The prisoners observed their guards playing cards under lantern light, laughing freely, spitting tobacco onto the ground, and riding horses with effortless mastery. Authority in this setting was not conveyed through shouted commands, but through the subtle tilt of a hat, the slow drawl of a word. To the Germans, raised in the shadow of strict order, this was baffling. How could discipline exist without fear? How could men command respect without raising their voices? One night, a prisoner recorded an observation in his diary. He had been walking near the fence after his day's labor, watching a cowboy lead his horse into the stable. The guard hummed as he worked, pausing occasionally to stroke the animal's neck, speaking to it softly. The German wrote, "I witnessed more kindness in his hand on that horse than I saw in 1,000 salutes to my officers. It was a revelation, authority derived not from fear, but from care." Humor also served as a bridge between the two groups. In one camp, prisoners played soccer within the fence while guards cheered from the exterior. A ball sailed too far, and a cowboy returned it with surprising agility. The Germans responded with laughter and mock applause. The guard tipped his hat, a grin on his face. It was an absurd situation. Enemies engaged in a shared game. The barbed wire was the only demarcation between them, yet within that absurdity lay a truth the Germans could not ignore. Humanity seeped through even the most formidable boundaries. And so the internal conflict intensified. Was this kindness a facade, or was it genuine? Could men indoctrinated to believe in brutality accept dignity from those they deemed enemies? Every meal, every handshake, every note of music pressed the question deeper. Some responded with defiance, clinging to their former pride. Others silently began to question if they had been mistaken all along. The camp's routines might have appeared commonplace to external observers: work, meals, rest. Yet, for the prisoners, each day eroded their certainties. The barbed wire confined them physically, but within its perimeter, ideas flowed with surprising freedom. Discussions, research, and recreational activities slowly instilled a new perspective on liberty deep within their beings. As the colder months enveloped the vast open lands, the nights became extended and frigid. The captive men huddled in their sleeping quarters, their blankets drawn close, their exhales forming clouds in the biting atmosphere. Beyond the confines, lanterns cast their glow, and the ranch hands moved with measured steps, their boot spurs emitting soft chimes on the hardened earth. Filtering through the thin partitions, the German soldiers could discern the faint melodies of a harmonica, a solitary tune drifting through the encampment. Some closed their eyes, allowing the music to transport them. Others remained awake, troubled, grasping that their confinement had offered them a glimpse of something more potent than harshness, an understanding of freedom that could not be erased. And in the hushed moments preceding slumber, a whispered inquiry traveled from one cot to another, a question no one dared to voice openly. If this is how the United States treats its detained individuals, then how much more liberated must its citizens be? The conclusion of the conflict arrived not with a thunderous declaration within the compounds, but with a hushed murmur. Word spread through the barracks in the spring of 1945. Germany had capitulated. The Reich had collapsed. Hitler was deceased. The men sat in stunned silence on their beds, gazing at their footwear, their hands, the wooden planks beneath them. Some wept discreetly, others clenched their fists, incapable of envisioning a reality devoid of the governing force that had shaped their existence. Yet beyond the fencing, the cowboys continued their routines, tending to livestock, savoring their coffee, preparing their saddles before the break of day. For the incarcerated, the downfall of their homeland starkly contrasted with the unvarying tempo of the surrounding ranch life. The Reich had pledged enduring stability and delivered devastation. The cowboy offered no assurances, yet he persevered. The process of repatriation commenced at a gradual pace. Trains once again formed orderly lines, prepared to convey the vanquished across the Atlantic. Many of the prisoners felt a sense of relief at the prospect of returning home. However, a profound melancholy also accompanied this, an unarticulated disquiet. They had entered America with absolute conviction that it was cruel, decadent, and inferior to the might of the Reich. They now departed laden with paradoxes, their bellies filled with cornbread, their ears echoing with cowboy melodies, and their hearts holding recollections of a liberty they had never experienced prior to the war. Correspondence salvaged from those final weeks reveals this internal conflict. One soldier penned to his mother, "I am returning to you transformed." The Americans did not strike me. They extended their hands in greeting. They did not let me starve. They provided me with sustenance to the point of shame. They did not degrade me. They permitted me to labor. They compensated me. They treated me as if I retained my humanity. Another described the cowboys with particular detail. They lead lives of greater hardship than ours, yet they are more liberated. Their adherence to order stems not from apprehension, but from mutual regard. I often contemplate them. It was during those minor instances, moments that seemed inconsequential at the time, that the profound shift solidified. A handshake after a strenuous day of fence mending. A segment of watermelon shared amidst the sweltering heat of August. A harmonica melody drifting over the barrier, carried by the prairie breeze. For some, it was the sound of footsteps on a wooden veranda, spurs faintly chiming like bells. For others, it was the sight of a cowboy tipping his hat without arrogance, a gesture of courtesy so simple it lodged in their memories like a splinter. The Americans had not intended to alter them. The cowboy was not a proselytizer, nor a propagandist. He simply existed. His presence, his composure, his inherent dignity were sufficient. The prisoners began to invent narratives about him, half in jest, half in adoration. They claimed he feared no superior because he bowed to no one. They asserted his lands were so expansive that he could never be cornered. They declared his strength was not solely physical, but resided in the tranquil manner with which he faced the horizon, as though nothing could overcome him. These were not formal lessons, nor were they inscribed in the Geneva Accords. They were impressions absorbed quietly that reshaped the Germans' perception of both America and themselves. Upon their return to Europe, many carried these impressions as if they were contraband. Post-war Germany was a land of devastation, rationing, and frigid winters. Yet in their minds, there remained visions of wheat fields beneath the Nebraska sun, the acrid aroma of endless coffee in tin mugs, and the sight of men who toiled diligently without resorting to cruelty. Some even endeavored to replicate aspects of that existence. Cowboy associations emerged in West Germany during the 1950s, where men donned hats, strummed guitars, and reminisced about the aircraft they had once observed through barbed wire. A few even bestowed English names upon their farms, quietly honoring the land that had once held them captive, but had ultimately bestowed upon them a sense of dignity. Historians who have examined their correspondence and personal accounts concur. The interaction with the cowboys left an indelible mark, deeper than many comprehended at the moment. It was not that every German renounced their former ideologies or embraced American democracy. However, seeds were sown, seeds of doubt concerning the narratives they had been fed, seeds of admiration for a way of life that appeared both foreign and desirable. As one former prisoner confessed decades later, "I arrived in America an adversary. I departed perhaps not as a friend, but with respect. The cowboy imparted to me more knowledge of freedom than any general." The Americans themselves often understated the significance. For them, it was simply the correct course of action: to abide by the Geneva Convention, provide sustenance, permit labor, and maintain order. But perhaps, unintentionally, they demonstrated something more profound: that authority need not subjugate, that resilience could be quiet, that freedom could be embodied in the daily existence of a rancher who tipped his hat and carried his tools. Yet for the prisoners, this benevolence brought not only gratitude but also a sense of shame. They were aware that their families had endured bombings, starvation, and fear, while they had consumed beef stew and played soccer behind fences. This guilt lingered, weighing heavily on their consciences. Some admitted they dreaded their return home, fearing the confession of how well they had lived under the enemy's care. One man stated bluntly, "We lived better in captivity than our people did in freedom. What does that signify about us?" The question could not be readily answered. It haunted them as they reboarded trains, the wheels carrying them eastward, the land of cowboys receding behind them. At the docks, they glanced back towards the horizon where they had first arrived years prior. Some carried books they had studied in the camp. Others held small wooden carvings of horses, gifts crafted from discarded fragments. Many carried only memories, but all bore the burden of the question regarding the true meaning of freedom and why they had only experienced a semblance of it in defeat. The trains continued their journey, and through the windows the prisoners observed the American countryside for one last time. Fields shimmering with golden harvests, cattle grazing idly, small towns adorned with white church steeples. A boy waved at the passing train, unaware that the men within were the adversaries his father had fought. A cowboy on horseback appeared momentarily, a silhouette against the sky before vanishing into a cloud of dust. The prisoners pressed their faces against the glass, as if attempting to etch the image permanently into their minds. Years later, in interviews and memoirs, many continued to speak of that image, not of the battlefields of North Africa or the ruins of Berlin. but of a cowboy leaning against a fence, his spurs gleaming in the sunlight. The memory offered both solace and disquiet, a reminder that their war had concluded not with brutality, but with a quiet lesson they had never anticipated. And so, the narrative endures, not in statistics or treaties, but in the paradox of men who discovered liberty while confined, who encountered America not through speeches or propaganda, but through the dust, sweat, and placid dignity of cowboys. It is a narrative of adversaries disarmed not by bullets, but by bread, by coffee, by handshakes extended across the chasm of war. The trains vanished into the east, but the memory persisted, carried within the hearts of men who had once believed themselves destined to rule the world. They had encountered their captors in boots and hats, and could not forget them. And within that unforgettable image lay a final, lingering question. If the cowboy was authentic, then what else about America held the same truth?